This next session is called the Sandbox. And this is a big opportunity for us to get creative, get a bit of messy, and really, for the summit, this is our own little experimentation. And in the spirit of taking some risks, we're really excited about the Sandbox. And what we're trying to do with the Sandbox is create an opportunity and a container for us to become aware of, to discuss, to analyze, and to talk about when things didn't necessarily work out. Creating a culture where we are comfortable with our failures is massively important in order to create the solutions that we need. You can't take a risk, you can't create systemic change without being comfortable with the idea that things might not work out. And when we're not comfortable with things not working out, then we don't take the risks that we need. But it takes a lot. So today, in the spirit of experimentation, we're gonna do a couple of things on stage and together to create a culture where we're comfortable with things not working out. And to start, let's try something together. So if you would oblige, I want to invite you all to close your eyes. Just close your eyes and let's take a deep breath together. And I want you to think about a time that you have failed professionally. A time when your intentions were good, but things really went wrong and there were consequences. How did this make you feel? Did you want to curl up in a ball and maybe hide under a table? Not under one of these tables, if that's okay with you. And let's change that. Let's change the feelings about wanting to hide from our failures. And we're going to do that. Ashley Good to Fail Forward is going to take us to an exercise where we're going to think a little bit differently. And in the meantime, and kind of to get things forward, we've asked someone to join us up on the stage to kind of publicly discuss an instance where they failed, to really model that behavior. So I'm really excited to be inviting up Stephen Huddart, who's the president and the CEO of the McConnell Foundation, who's going to discuss some of the ways that McConnell has used failure to improve its programs. And just a couple words on McConnell: shying away from open discussions about challenges and failure too often stands in the way of social innovation and breakthroughs on the toughest challenges of our times. Realizing this, the McConnell Foundation has begun shifting the ways in which it approaches failure by inviting its staff and partners to share lessons learned that could be useful to others in the field. These reflections were shared in the Foundation's 2018 12 Lesson Series. Folks, please welcome me in joining Stephen.
Thank you. Good to see you. Thanks.
Longtime fan. Such a great way for us to finally meet like this. And I really appreciate what you're doing today and the courage it takes to share. So, Stephen, you have the floor now. About 5 minutes, can you tell us about a time that something did not go the way intended and how this has experienced your work today?
Sure. Adil, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, if I may, because the story I have to tell does relate to and informs our approach to reconciliation. So we are on the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty, and traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Anishinaabe peoples. And the story that I have to tell is one that came out of a national program that we were running in Canada in the early 2000s called Art Smarts. And the idea was to put artists to work in classrooms, helping teachers to integrate the arts as a way of teaching. And it was really, the goal was to preserve the place of the arts in education. Out of the blue, we got a call from a school in northern Alberta that said, could you please bring that program here? We're desperate to try anything. They were a school of failure. They had, for the previous decade and longer, consistently ranked at the bottom of the Alberta education test rankings every year, and they wanted to try something different. And we looked around for an Alberta partner, and another foundation stepped up and said, yeah, we'd like to work on that with you. So we introduced the program, the Art Smarts program, to a school in a remote area about 200 kilometers north of Edmonton, thinking, well, this is going to be great. We've got artists coming in to work with the teachers. We know from our experience across the country that they're going to love it. Well, something happened. Kids were engaged, artists were hired, and at Christmas time, the kids put on a pageant for the community, and they talked about the pain they were experiencing from suicide, from parents who were absent or drinking and whatever, and the community saw this and saw itself reflected and was profoundly moved. We heard about that, and then at the end of the year, when those test scores the testing was done, we were surprised to find that the scores had actually dropped. And not by a little, but by quite a bit. So we looked at it, the person running the program, we had an intermediary in place, they looked at it and said, well, maybe we've tried to do too much at once. Let's pull back and recalibrate. We hadn't educated the teachers, adequately prepared them to work this way, so we put on some workshops. Year 2 ran and unfolded. Didn't hear too much, but waiting. What happened at the end of year 2? Universal testing, the scores went down again. They were already low. Now they were in the sub-basement. And this is the point when the program officer in Montreal had to go, reputational risk, what are we doing here? Our Alberta partner was saying, we thought this is about raising the bar and improving test scores and so on. We went out. I said, well wait, let's go there. And so I flew to Edmonton, rented a car, drove 200 kilometers north to near the community of Buffalo Lake. And I went into the school cafeteria when I got there, was waiting to meet the principal, and I ran into the only other person there was the bus driver. And she said, you're that guy from Montreal, from the Art Smarts program? She said, I just want to tell you something. It used to take me 2 hours in the morning to pick up all the kids to come to school. My job's over in an hour now, because the kids are waiting by the side of the road. They want to come here. And she said, and the bus is full. I said, well, that's interesting. And I had just read Freakonomics, which kind of got us all thinking about economic data and what it sometimes masks about what's really going on. When I met the principal, wonderful guy, a fisherman from Nova Scotia, he poked me in the chest and he said, listen, before we start this conversation, I just want to tell you one thing. If you're here to shut down this program, forget it. It's actually saving kids' lives. I went, okay, well, let's talk. So we looked at all the data that he had, and one of the things that stood out right away was attendance was going way up. Kids were coming back to school who hadn't been there for years, or were coming maybe once a week or once a month. They were now coming every day. And think about what that did to average scores on standardized tests. It was dragging down those results. I met a girl who was in grade 7 who said, Art Smarts is the only reason I come to school. I went from grade 2 reading last year to grade 7 in 1 year, and I'm learning to play the violin. I've got my first professional gig this weekend. There was something very different going on in the school that made us realize that we needed to keep the program going. So 3rd year, we've explained to the funders, to the government, the school board, we need to keep this happening because something is emerging here. One of the very positive data points was that up until that first year of Art Smarts, the pattern was 100% of the teachers would quit at the end of the year, and all new teachers would come in September of the following year. That second year of Art Smarts, all the teachers stayed. Nobody quit. Everyone was committing to building a new relationship and a new way of working. So at the end of the 3rd year, just to finish this part of the story, the scores did go down again, but we knew why. And in the 4th year, that school was the most improved school in the province of Alberta. And in the 5th year, they reached the median or exceeded it on every metric being used. So thank you, yeah. A couple of things that we draw from that immediately is, one is just be careful which metrics you're using. And 2, systems change often has a J-curve similar to the J-curve that we see in the venture capital business. You put your money in and you expect, okay, we're going to start making money. No, you don't. The J-curve is actually, you start losing money at the beginning because you've got training and adjustment and clarifying, understanding, and so on. We have to expect that in systems change, that there is that latent period as things get sorted out. But boy, does it take close attention to make it work.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I have a very visual image of someone kind of pointing you in the chest and saying, don't close it. How did that feel for you, kind of confronted with that situation?
Well, I got to tell you, I was living a sense of failure, that this was a big commitment we made to a community, to partners, national program, and this thing really stood out as something that was not working. And so I had to take personal responsibility for that. Going there in person was part of it. But I think, failure is a little bit like medicine. It is medicine for people who want to create positive change. It's not pleasant, it can be painful, unpleasant, but boy, does it help us get better at being good observers, good listeners, good relationship builders, good thinkers, and good decision makers. So failure was teaching me a lot in that visit to the community.
Great, and I think it's so wonderful and important for you to personalize that too, especially when we are in positions of power to acknowledge that we are individually responsible.
Yeah.
But taking it to the organization, did it in any way change the way the organization was operating or thinking?
Well, the first thing was we decided not to cancel the program because that was the first decision. And as a leader or somebody with that responsibility that you speak of, we sometimes have to stand up beside results that are not that positive and explain what it is we're learning and why we need to keep going, or sometimes why we need to back out. But the point is, taking personal responsibility for that failure is the key first step. It's not them, it's not their problem, it's your problem. And in this case, not only did it keep the program going and did we celebrate the positive results that eventually happened, but it became part of two kind of continuous learning journeys for us. One around reconciliation. We've got a lot of situations in our country and in our cities where alien, or what are experienced as alien or imposed structures, whether in child welfare, as Diane Rusin was talking about today, or in education. And we've got a kind of colonialist model mindset, we know what's best for you, et cetera, a paternalistic and non-productive, non-functional relationship. We have to be able to unpack those. And that takes close observation, reflection, and a level of humility about what's failure trying to teach us here. Now, this is not, something that just, this became part of how McConnell worked. We already had a kind of ethic of, don't tell us your successes and your rah-rah stories. Tell us what's not working and how you're trying to solve things that don't work. Because that's really the coal face, the learning edge of innovation, the R&D component. And speaking of R&D, the Nobel Prize in Economics was just given to JLab, including, by the way, to only the second woman and the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. And what are they doing? They're running experiments where there's lots of failure, but where they're paying attention and learning from what doesn't work, how can we improve this, what can we test in order to generate better results. So the whole field of developmental economics has emerged as an entity, as a field, because people were paying attention to failure. And I think we've got a corollary exercise underway in our work, developmental evaluation, which looks at what's going on, what's the bus driver saying about what's happening, what are the water cooler conversations telling us, how do we capture a sense of what isn't working as well as the official version of what is. And I think that's part of the mindset, the approach, and the permission we need to give ourselves when we're working on big challenges in our cities around climate change or homelessness, whatever that is. A lot of it isn't working. So let's be honest about it and ask better questions.
Great. You mentioned, you've mentioned being able to create the time and space to do that reflection and those learnings. Maybe something constructive that people might struggle with is, as a funder, you may have that opportunity to do that. As an organization receiving the funding, though, there may not always be the space and time to do that, let alone the expectations that you can fail. So how is that learning at your organizational level trickling down to those that you're working with? Yeah,
that's a great question. Thank you. And I think at McConnell, I can tell you a little bit about how we're handling this. So we actively cultivate a way of talking about failure and sharing failures, our failures and those of our grantees. We try to build the trust that people that we're funding don't feel like, oh, we can't tell that because we'll lose our funding. It's no, let's sit down and work together and look at it. We do a harvest of those lessons that we and our partners learn, and we publish every year. You mentioned 12lessons.mcconnellfoundation.ca is where we capture and share some of the best learnings from failure that we've had over the previous year. Ashley's work, which we've supported and celebrate, I think is helping other efforts like that to encourage us to be open about the learning we're doing. So it's not failure per se, it's what are you doing about it? How is it influencing your practice? What questions do you have that could be perhaps more widely shared so that we can all take part, or we can broaden the solution space that surrounds some of our toughest challenges.
Wonderful. So for those who are working in organizations which are not your own, what guidance would you give if there doesn't currently exist a culture where failure is openly discussed and harvested?
Yeah, I think it takes time to build the relationships of trust where people get to know you and you get to know them, where you talk about your own anxieties, failures, concerns. If we can create that kind of rebalancing of the power dynamic between funders and people getting funding, I think government has a big role to play here in opening up to experimentation, to social R&D, as we call it. So, it's an ongoing effort. I think anybody that is working in this space knows what I'm talking about when you say, oh my God, we can't talk about that. Mm-hmm. But in fact, when you do, I think it has a ripple effect and just encourages develops much better results for the outcome.
Great.
Yeah.
And just a question about teams. I think one of the biggest concerns around failure is what it might do to a team from a morale perspective, from a perception of the impact that they're having. How do you as a leader motivate your team in situations where things aren't working well to kind of to get out of that and also recognize there's some okayness with this?
Right. Well, I think first of all, it is a team effort, and as a leader or as somebody responsible for team results, I really do want to create those conditions for collegial, open exchange of information. So I need to spend time with the team, and at McConnell we try to involve not just the program staff, but our admin staff, our financial managers, everyone in the conversation about what are we learning here, and connecting failure and learning in developing an organizational culture is sort of at the base of this. It's like it's painful medicine, it's expensive, but let's use it well, and let's create that shared culture of commitment to each other's success. And let's really work together on surfacing what isn't working, not ignoring it, not pretending it's not happening, not covering it up, but saying, this is interesting, let's talk about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. You said something earlier, there's some advice I was given years ago, or guidance, someone said, the power is in the question, not necessarily the answer. So I just wanted to circle back to that point. There is so much power that comes when we take the time to ask questions.
Right.
And so I'm happy to hear that you're doing that with the people you're working with within your team.
Yeah, and I think just from the outset, establishing those parameters of that relationship where, we're all human beings, we happen to have some funding that we can contribute, but you're the person living with the problem. You've got all of those resources, responsibilities, pressures. Let's acknowledge that at the outset and recognize that this is actually a relationship of equals, and let's try and rebalance that way. So
wonderful. Just a couple minutes left. Any final thoughts on this topic you want to share? That we didn't get to?
No, I think that I guess just to come back to the theme of reconciliation, where we started, that as a country, we're dealing with a spectacular failure, a compounded failure. There was an attempt to take the Indian out of the child, to really eliminate a culture. It was a genocidal act, and we have a lot to do to make up for that, including unpacking some of our own assumptions, often about what Western culture is, what power is, and so on. We've got a lot to learn from Indigenous partners and from the processes of reconciliation. That's in our cities, it's in our institutions. There's a lot that we can, and I know it's going on here at Evergreen. You have a director of Indigenous learning and outreach. In a lot of our work, there are extraordinary resources to be mined from that failure as we all come together to build a society for generations to come.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
I just want to also acknowledge one thing you said, is particularly as given your role and position to acknowledge the genocide that has occurred, I think is really important to speak that truth and to bring awareness to it is the only way that we have a legitimate shot of actually moving forward and in a way that is constructive and healthy for communities.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing.
It's
what you
great to
shared
be
on
able to
stage.
be here, and congratulations to the organizers of this extraordinary event and initiative. We're really pleased to be part of it.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Steven.
All right, great.
Now, I'm about to get off stage as well, but I have the honor of introducing the next person up here, Ashley Good from Fail Forward. Ashley I've known for years, actually, and just kind of seen the evolution of her work. So I'm really excited about this. And I'll just say that Fail Forward is the world's first failure consultancy, and they support people and organizations to acknowledge, create, and evolve from failure. And Ashley's going to take us through an exercise following the leadership of some of our previous speakers and Stephen, to get more comfortable and aware about our failures and particularly what we can learn from it. Everybody, Ashley.
Hi. Thanks, Adil. So we just had this wonderful example from Stephen about what it looks like to fail intelligently. He acknowledged the failure, spent, it sounds like, years analyzing what they could do differently and applying that learning to improve the program year after year, and of course, the willingness to keep trying, hopefully more wisely, the next time around. This is really at the heart of what it means to fail well. I'm going to give you the answer right off the top here. You want to know how to fail intelligently? The heart and soul of intelligent failure is knowing. And I mean like really deep down knowing that it is always possible to move forward more wisely. So that's my perspective. I'm curious about your perspective, though. If you think about the term intelligent failure, imagine yourself showing up to your place of work and you are great at failing well and failing intelligently, and all your colleagues are great at failing well and failing intelligently. What does that look like? What does intelligent failure mean to you in your context? If you have an answer to that question, I invite you to yell it out really loudly, because this is a huge room. What's your answer to what does it mean to fail intelligently to you? Speaking out about sharing that. Fearlessly speaking out. I love that, and sharing that learning, I imagine. Thank you. Reflecting. Brilliant. Evaluation? Yeah, being able to document that, share that. I have asked this question of like countless groups now, and what's amazing to me is that everyone already knows this stuff. Every group I've ever asked this question, I give them a few minutes and to chat with their colleagues, and they will come up with a complete and a robust and nuanced answer to what it means to fail intelligently that is as good as any definition that I could give you. And isn't that great? We already know this stuff. And as Adil pointed out in the framing of this session, we also know that in getting good at this, it opens up room to innovate. We all know we should do this because as we improve our ability to fail well, it opens up that room for creating positive change and innovating, because we know even if our ideas don't work out, we're only going to grow stronger and wiser from the experience. So we know we should do it, we know how to do it. The challenge is in actually doing that in practice. And that is what I am up on stage to do with you today. In a moment, we are all going to practice dealing with our own failures intelligently, practice dealing with them well in a way that allows us to move forward more wisely. To do that, I'm going to invite you to continue. I know Adil asked you at the beginning to think of that work failure. I'm going to ask you to reflect on that failure for a moment and think of a time you failed on the job that you wouldn't mind sharing with a partner in this room. So make sure it's one that you wouldn't mind sharing. The only rules of the kind of failure you choose are that it should be your failure. Sounds obvious, it's not. Something you hold responsibility for, you messed up, at least can take some of the credit for that failure. And that it is a failure that happened on the job. I know often our personal failures are the ones that come to our mind first. It's been my experience in a professional context like that the richest learning comes from sharing those professional stories. So I'll give you a minute just to make sure everyone has a story in mind. And if you're struggling, do not overthink this. Big, small, involve you, involve a whole team. It can be something that's labeled a success, but you knew you could have done better. It can be something you didn't do, but maybe you should have. And if you're in the fortuitous position to have too many failures and you can't choose one, just pick the one that weighs on you the most. Anyone need more time? You can throw your arms up. Okay. Hopefully everyone's got a story in mind. So as I said, I'm going to invite you to share your story with a partner in a few moments, but that also means that, so everyone will be sharing a story, means that everyone will also be listening to a story of failure. So I want to start us off by practicing and building our skill of showing up as a great listener. So I invite you to introduce yourself to the folks at your table if you don't know them already, and reflect on this question. How can a listener show up for you to make you feel safe and help you learn? What would it look like to be a great listener to a failure story? I'll give you a few minutes to discuss that at your table. All right, I'm going to invite your attention back. Again, I asked this question of many, many, many groups. Every group is different because we all need something slightly different to feel safe sharing our stories of failure. I guess what I would like us all to accept as the guidelines, the bar we all strive to jump over, are up on the screen right now. These are the basic things it takes to be a great listener to a failure story that I invite us all to strive to practice when we share and listen to our stories. The first is, of course, to listen, put your phones away, really show up for the person. We're such great problem solvers. Often that's where our mind goes. Oh, you just needed to do this. Not usually helpful. Unless requested, don't try to solve it for them. Obviously being supportive. That next one's kind of fun, the acknowledge and validating the struggle. For many folks, this is transformational. If you can show up as a listener and start and say something as simple as like, wow, that would have been really hard. Just to feel heard and acknowledged allows a lot of people to set that aside and look forward about what they can learn. So really important. Obviously, confidentiality is often a big concern. For the purposes of the sharing that we're about to do, I invite us to not share your partner's story unless they explicitly tell you that it's fine. And then that next one's really important. You're about to hear a failure story. And you might hear that story and think, you call that a failure? It might seem super surface level to you. I can tell you with a great deal of confidence that the person sharing that story always feels more vulnerable than you hear as the listener. So just take time to appreciate the incredible amount of courage it takes to share a failure story. And then ask curious, how and what questions. How did that happen? What came about that helped the teller dive into what they can learn? And that's really what I'm going to guide you through in this exercise. I invite you to adopt those rules as well as any others that came up at your tables that you want to build on to become that great listener. So those are our baseline rules for becoming a good listener. We also need to be a great teller. Fortunately, we had an example up on stage just a few minutes ago of what it looks like to share a story really well. What did you like about the way Stephen shared his story? What helped you learn from that experience that you would want to model in your own sharing of failure? And again, I invite you to yell very loudly. Take responsibility. Thank you. Yeah, it's great. Humility. Yeah. Thanks. Open-mindedness. Absolutely. And that willingness to change and talk about it, I imagine, too. So I'll set out some basic guidelines for us. I appreciate that everyone has their own beautiful storytelling style that should always be honored. The only one of these rules that I really consider a rule, that I'm really a stickler for, is to not blame. This one's really important. The failure might be 99% not your fault. Talk about the 1%. That's where you're going to learn, because it is infinitely easier to change your own behavior based on what you learn than to change somebody else's. So really focus on the part that you had responsibility for. If you have to implicate somebody else in the story, try to tell it as if they were right beside you, but they just can't speak, so you get to share it from their perspective. Look for those root causes, getting below those first-order reasons for why the failure happened, and of course, focus on what you learned, how you grow wiser from the experience. I think we're ready. So how this is going to work, as I said, I'm going to invite you to get into partners. Partners, 2 people. This exercise doesn't actually work with groups of 1 or 3. Fortunately, we have this small army of volunteers everywhere who can step in or out as needed to make sure everyone has a partner. So you're going to be in partners. 1 person will be the teller, 1 person will be the listener. The teller, I'm going to give you 60 seconds to share your story. And then the listener will ask curious questions that help you dive into what you can learn. Teller, same teller, is going to tell their story 1 more time, this time in only 30 seconds. And I'm going to invite you to frame the story in terms of what you learned. How are you wiser because that situation happened? After that, we switch. Tellers become listeners, listeners become tellers. We do it all over again. I know that sounds so complicated the way that I just described it. Don't worry about it. I will lead you through each step, what is important to acknowledge is that this will be very difficult. You could fail at this, which is so appropriate and perfect. So I invite you to take this risk. I realize it's very hard to share a very complex story in 60 seconds, let alone 30 seconds. I'm going to invite you to do it anyway and strive. It will be important to listen for my cues from the front, though. And with that, I'm going to invite you to pick a partner, and in the spirit of risk-taking, I'm actually going to invite you to find the person at your table or in your area that you know the least to share this story with. Now, this really is an invitation. If today is not your day, feel free to kind of step out, but find your partner. Don't share yet. If you don't have a partner, throw your arm way up. And people with their arms find each other, volunteers. I'll ask for your help in making sure everyone has a partner, and over a couple minutes of chaos, we'll figure it out. All right, anyone not have a partner? Throw your arm way, way, way up. Volunteers, feel free to join those humans or help them find another human with their hand up. Let's make sure everyone finds a partner. All right. Great, okay. So we're gonna get started. All right. You, of course, can decide who the teller is first, if you haven't already decided that by starting your stories. If you haven't decided who's gonna tell your story first, then the person closest to me is the teller. And if that doesn't work, because round tables are round, then the person closest to the fire kiln is the teller. So does everyone have a partner that wants one and knows who their teller is? Okay, let's say yes. Like I said, tellers, I'm going to give you 60 seconds to share your failure story. To do that, I'm first going to give you a few moments to consider what your failure story sounds like. What's at the heart of your story? What's really important to convey? All right, guys. I can see you're raring to go, so your 60 seconds starts now. All right, good job, tellers. That is hard. So now it's our listeners' job to do a little bit of work. I invite you to practice those guidelines for being a great listener and ask curious questions that help your teller dive into what they can learn from the experience. Some example questions are up on the board there. What makes this failure meaningful? What did you learn? What caused you to behave in that way? How might you have detected this failure sooner? Also remember to ask, what did you do really well? Inevitably, there's no such thing as a 100% failure. You know, there's always things we did well that we can also learn from amidst those experiences. So tellers, I'm going to give you a couple minutes. Listeners, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to ask your tellers these curious questions. You can ask whatever questions you like. The goal here is to help your teller dive into what they can learn from that experience. How are they stronger, better, smarter, wiser because that experience happened? So I'll give you a couple minutes for that, that dialogue. Thanks. Thanks. All right. I realize those conversations could go on for ages. Luckily, we have lunch after this, so feel free to continue them. But I want to invite our tellers, once again, to share their story of failure. So same teller, I'm going to invite you to share your story one more time, but this time I'm only going to give you 30 seconds, and I invite you to reframe that failure in terms of what you learned, in terms of that conversation you just had. How are you stronger, better, smarter, wiser because that experience happened? And try to tell the failure in terms of what you learned. Again, I'll give you just a moment to consider what's at the core of that learning story. And your 30 seconds starts now. Seconds, halfway. And 3, 2, 1. Brilliant. We're going to now switch roles. Tellers become listeners, listeners become tellers. We're pros at this. Our new tellers, I am going to invite you to share your failure story. Again, I will give you just 60 seconds. So I invite you to take a few seconds now and think about what your story sounds like in a minute. What's really at the heart of your story, our new tellers. And your 60 seconds starts now. All right, thank you. I, again, appreciate that can be very difficult. Listeners, our new listeners, your turn to do a little bit of work asking those curious how and what questions. The same example questions are up on the screen for you. As I mentioned, feel free to read through these, but also feel free to ask any other questions that you are curious about. The goal here is to help your teller dive in to what they can learn from this experience. And again, I'll give you a couple minutes for that discussion. Thank you all. I invite our tellers once again to share their story of failure, this time in just 30 seconds, and as we did last round, framed in terms of what you learned. In terms of the conversation you just had, how are you stronger, wiser, better, smarter because that experience happened? Try to share the story with that framing. Once again, I'll give you a moment just to think through what's most important about that learning story that you're going to share. And your 30 seconds starts now. Seconds, halfway. And 3, 2, 1, stop. Now, given that our goal was in part to experience failure in a whole new way, but also to explore the role of failure in how it might contribute to our learning, growth, and the positive change that we want to make in the world, what was that experience like for you? Did anything surprise you? Anything you're taking away? And I'll ask you to reflect on that individually, but if it feels right, feel free to share what you're taking away or what surprised you with your partner. All right, I see I'm running out of time, and I want to share, well, actually, I'm going to outsource my closing thoughts to this man right here. His name is Benjamin Zander, and he is the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. He's also an educator, and he has a thought on what we all can do to deal with our failures well. And I'll just let him speak for himself.
The teacher is always right. The teacher is
and the students
always
try
right.
to be right. And as one of these young ladies said, the best way to be right is not to say anything, then you won't be wrong. Now, I believe the exact opposite, which is you cannot learn anything unless you make a mistake. So I tell my students, when you make a mistake, celebrate. And the way to celebrate is like this. How fascinating. It's actually quite difficult. Try it out on the golf course next time you're out. You know why it's difficult is because when we make a mistake, we tend to pull down, the body pull down, we tend to pull down, the body pull down. Notice the next time you make a mistake, the body pulls down. Now instead, when it pulls down, you go, how fascinating, it's like this, it's difficult to do, you know.
Thank you, Ben. I invite you to think about your failure. Perhaps it's the one that you just talked about, perhaps it's the personal one that I told you not to talk about. Any failure that's still weighing on your shoulders and making your body pull down. And I want you to really go back there, in the midst of that failure. I'm going to do it too. And on the count of 3, instead of letting our bodies pull down, we are all going to throw our arms up and yell, "How fascinating!" Your giggles tell me you might be feeling a little silly or embarrassed about this. It's okay, you can close your eyes so no one can see you, but for real, we are all going to do this. All right, are you ready? So, I invite you to get comfy in your chairs, close your eyes, go back to the midst of that failure. Remember what it was like there. And on the count of 3, instead of letting our bodies pull down, 1, 2, 3, how fascinating! Thank you. Yeah. Thank you to all of you for the courage to share your story and participate in a failure session. Thank you to the organizers, to the band, and as I invite Adil back up here to kind of usher you into lunch, I believe, I invite you actually just one more time to turn to your partner and thank them for that courage to share and the wisdom you gained. Thank you.